So thank you for inviting me here, and I'm going to present this presentation about assessing serious evil, although you see a happy one there. It's about bioethical considerations of drug control, and I prepared this with my good friend and colleague Imre Bárt, who is at the methodology department at the London School of Economics here in the UK. So the topic of my presentation will be the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. I will be criticizing or sometimes bashing this for a while. And so this is an international convention which was signed in 1961 in New York City and became effective in 75. And 185 parties signed this convention, except for a few countries with funny names far away who are, I don't think they can be considered as drug paradises anyway. But it's a very strong international convention, and all these countries are obligated to have some measures against those narcotic drugs that are included into those lists or schedules. So the text of this preamble says that these parties are concerned with the health and welfare of mankind, and they recognize that the medical use of narcotic drugs are indispensable for the relief of pain and suffering, and that adequate provision must be made to ensure the availability of narcotic drugs for such purposes. But they at the same time recognize that addiction to narcotic drugs constitutes a serious evil for the individual and is fraught with social and economic danger to mankind. The parties say that they are conscious of their duty to prevent and combat this evil. So this word of evil is what caught my attention, and I will be walking around this concept in great detail. So first of all, what is evil? On the next slide, you might be disturbed if you are not watching a lot of horror movies, but this is what Google Images says that what evil is. It's like black and red and some white. Basically, evil is a moral judgment. So you may ask that what is the place of morals here? Evil is an interesting concept because it invites a reaction to eliminate whatever is evil. It's not like that you are trying to negotiate with the evil or you try to kind of understand it. It's a straight rejection and this combating. The preamble says that we need to combat against addiction, but what is exactly the addiction? Addiction is an abstract notion, and practically it means addicted drug users. So there's a very implicit mechanism to combat against drug users who are human people. Beside this sole reference to the religious concept of profound immorality, this international treaty has never been further justified by secular ethics based on logic, reason, moral intuition, or else. We should see the context of these UN conventions. So there are lots of UN conventions. At the moment, there are conventions against bacteriological, biological, and toxic weapons, which are not evil. According to the UN, there's a discrimination against women, which are not evil. Sorry, girls, it's not evil. There's a genocide, which is also not evil. It's just an odious scourge. That sounds very funny. I love this. It's like a bad guy from a movie. I'm odious scourge, and I'm going to genocide you. But it's not evil. And nuclear terrorism, not evil. Nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, not evil. Racial discrimination is morally condemnable, but not evil. Taking of hostages, an offense of grave concern, but not evil. Terrorist bombings, no. And torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading, but not evil. And narcotic drugs are, they are evil. So this is the only UN convention which mentions some kind of evilness in its wording. So what is the logic and scope of this convention? First of all, it needs to combat because of the problem of addiction. Addiction is actually, it's either behavior or property of addicts, I mean humans. And there is this think that the convention is actually used to combat against non-addicts, or also against non-addicts. So this is like, it doesn't, the scope is not only the addicts because of their addiction who needs to be combated against, but it is used to combat against all human people, also including this very, very big proportion of non-addict people. For example, a possession of small amounts of listed drugs, they are not technically included into the convention. There are requirements to take measures against, but implicitly it is there because the countries are using this convention to implement into their own criminal laws, and in which possession of small amounts of listed drugs is illegal in most of the parties who signed the convention. The convention requires only serious offenses to be punished by imprisonment. This is quite unclear here what is a serious offense. So the countries can decide in their own legislation that which offenses are considered as serious. It's mostly trafficking of drugs. There's a question. I mostly make here questions because I'm not telling you the answers, but you may think about these questions. That do criminal measures prevent addiction, actually? So the criminal measures which are the outcome of these conventions or the requirements in order to combat addiction, do they actually prevent addiction? So that's a very interesting question and a very core question. So the UN logic box goes like this. We have materia, actually drugs, and there is addictive use, which is evil, as we know. There are also medical and scientific use, which are considered not evil. The medical use is obvious. The scientific use is also mentioned in the conventions. There were some very clever countries who made some reservations for themselves. The reservations are about the cultural, medicinal, quasi-medical, religious, and the traditional, which is magical or religious use of certain plants. These clever countries were Mexico, Nepal, Bolivia, and the United States. And they have these exceptions for the use of plants, unspecified plants in Mexico, and the use of opium and cannabis in Nepal, the chewing of coca leaves in Bolivia, and the US reserved the religious use of peyote by the Native American church. So these are not concerned by the UN Convention. And what is outside this UN logic box? There are lots of other drugs, and they have also addictive use of those other drugs, which are not considered evil, and actually any use of these other drugs are generally not considered evil. So there is no moralizing about any other drugs except for what are in the schedules. So to be a little technical, if we basically look at the relationship of two variables, one is X, which is a drug, and Y, which is a drug use or use of type of use, then basically this it's very easy by the logic of the UN that the drug X is with a use Y, it's something. It's mostly here it's like evil, and this is a very, very strange and very small picture, as you can see. So the bigger picture is a bit different. We can easily say that there are some other drugs which are also related to this variable Y. So they here, for example, addiction. So there's a non-X drug, number 1, number 2, blah blah until number N, and so this is a one-dimensional thinking. And then actually all these other drugs should be assessed to see that if what is the relation to this same Y, which is the drug use form. And in a similar way, in a two-dimensional table, we can see the other non-Y drug use reasons, like could be like medical reasons and others, for the same drug X, or actually all other drugs and all other drug uses should be put in a table properly, and not only making decisions because of this one relationship between X and Y. So this is basically what in a more scientific way or statistical way, all these should be assessed. So if we are talking about X and Y, we should also talk about X and the non-Ys, and or Y and the non-X's. So this is what would be a minimal base for a decent comparison. So this is actually what we can do. I'm not good at statistics, but if there are some statistics gurus, then please contact me after this presentation. This is a step in computing the chi-square test for independence by calculation the expecting count for each cell in the contingency table. So this is a very interesting concept for me. So I'm working on this in a paper, and this actually. We did some research before, and after assessing lots of drugs and lots of drug use purposes, we, for example, came out with this type of cross table, which is in a paper in preparation at the moment, but you might have seen this in my Amsterdam conference talk a few years before. So if you really do this cross table thing, then you will find some very interesting they're not actually correlations, but connections or relationships between two different domains. So in this preliminary research show that, for example, tobacco has been used for some offsetting some deficiencies very strongly, as well as amphetamine and stimulants had been used for physical enhancement. And there's a very interesting block here where LSD and mushrooms had been used for religious, spiritual, and self-knowledge reasons. So this is how you could assess lots of drugs and lots of drug use purposes. Yeah, there's the UK Psychoactive Substances Bill, which can be bashed again. So it basically says that it's very simple. So drugs are evil, all other stuff with all other types of use are not evil. So actually I found one exception because on the airplane it's been announced that if you use tobacco on the airplane, then it's a criminal offense, so it is evil a little bit. But basically this is the thing which is seems very unbased. Yeah. Okay, so it's I hope that I'm not aware of the proper status of this bill at the moment, but I hope there will be some real discussion about it in the UK. So the evidence shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So this XY relationship is okay, plus its context of X and the non-Y. Which is everything outside the Y, and the non-X and the Y. So these three conditions or groups of conditions make this relationship in its proper context. So not only a biased selected subset of psychoactive substances, and we cannot ignore all these other circumstances, outcomes, forms, and the functions of drug use. So substance use may cause harms that should be accepted, and we need regulations for the individual, for community, for society. That's also quite clear. But it's important to see that what are the consequences of regulation versus the consequences of non-regulation. So these should be somehow assessed, or the proportion should be measured. There's an interesting question of if or whether we want to reduce the prevalence, or if we would like to reduce the consequences or the harms or the negative consequences of the drug use. So this is also something that needs a balancing, and in harm reduction this is a very basic questions that if we would like to have less users who have high risk or more users with low risk. So this is it's a game of absolute numbers and relative numbers. Even more basic question that do we have a right to risk taking? This is the case of that you already know, the risk of taking ecstasy versus the risk of horseback riding or whatever else it can be, mountain climbing. So there are lots of risk risky activities around. And taken a little bit further, do we have a right to self-harming? And what should be the appropriate societal response to self-harming people? Is it a crime in itself, or what is the situation actually? And there is the thing of risk assessment. You have seen probably this David Nutt et al. Tables of risk assessment. It had been done also for the European Union, so there's lots of evidence of different levels of risk concerning different substances. But that's one thing that we can have nice nice measures for scheduled substances. But is it somehow logical that substances with a bigger risk they should receive more punishment because of they have bigger risk? So in some sense it's not very sensible to punish those people who take more risk because they might be in a worse situation already. So this is not a linear correlation that the bigger risks, the more punishment. So these are basically ethical questions. That's why there's a question mark at the end of each row. So these need some serious thinking, and we can apply some principles of biomedical ethics. Although in this question it's not strictly medical, but the principles are the following. There are four categories of or four principles in biomedical ethics. There's a respect for autonomy. It's respecting the decision-making capacities of autonomous persons, enabling individuals to make reasoned, informed choices. Another principle is beneficence. So it is the balancing of benefits and of treatment against the risks and costs. The healthcare professional should act in a way that benefits the patient, or any other actor should act like that. There's a principle of non-maleficence, which is avoiding the causation of harm. It is accepted that all treatments involve some harm, but any intervention should not harm the patient. So even if minimal risk is involved, or harm is involved, but the harm shouldn't be disproportionate to the benefits of treatment. So it's, again, a balancing. And the fourth principle is justice. It's distributing the benefits, risk, and costs fairly. It's the notion that patients in similar positions should be treated in a similar manner. So these four principles are usually assessed when we are talking about medical or bioethics. These are also like in a way that there should be some kind of a trade-off between these four. So it's very rare that everything goes fine. So it's always a balancing and weighing the risks of or the consequences concerning all these four principles. But this could be some type of scientifically or ethically based implementation of drug laws, for instance. The questions raised by drug control, so concerning the respect of autonomy, there's a question of what is the legitimacy of self-medication and self-enhancement. So it's, as said, this drug control is a social control, of a form of social control. So it's usually there's an authorized group of people who can do something with the drugs to other groups of people. But what if, like medication, for instance, but what if someone decides to be self-medicated? Or what if a person takes some types of drugs just for the sole purpose of self-enhancement, so without any kind of medical disorders? So if we assume that these are autonomous citizens, then there should be at least some respect for their autonomy. In the beneficence principle, the question is if drug control can efficiently or beneficiently combat the addiction. This is what I mentioned before. So it needs a stronger proof that in combating addiction, those measures are appropriate and beneficial. in the non-maleficence principle, it's very clear that drug control measures should not cause more social evil than what they prevent. So this is a bit messy if we look at the implementations of the UN convention, because there are like spraying farmers' crops in South America and other things, and just like locking up lots of people because of just possession of small amounts of drugs. So there's lots of maleficent consequences of the drug control or implementing or enforcing it. The principle of justice raises the question that what is the balance between the problem use and the non-problem use. There is in some way this thing which I call the probability transfer, which is that if someone can get convicted because of say drug possession, because of a theoretical other person somewhere sometimes had done something bad or evil when using drugs. So this is a very unclear thing. There is not a clear case to which we can compare this actual case of another person, because it is just a hypothetical thing that stemming from the idea that drug use is for addiction and addiction is evil, so anyone who gets in touch with this material is also to be condemned. And so applying to this, we can, applying to the 1961 convention, these principles about the respect for autonomy, we can say that there is no. There are victimless crimes done by autonomous individuals. Victimless crime is, for example, possession of some drug or consuming a drug at home without any kind of involvement of other people's. So there cannot be victims of this activity. In the beneficence principle, we can say that there is no beneficence because the problem of addiction, which was to be solved in the first place, has not decreased by any statistics. The non-maleficence, the answer for this is also a no. There are, like I said, there were grave environmental and social consequences of this drug control. And what comes to justice, there's also a no. There is a very big exceptioning of other substances. So this is very unbalanced that for some outcome with a scheduled drug, there are some other outcomes with the non-scheduled drugs, and one is evil and the other one is not evil. So justice is really not implemented here. About drug policies, it would be very feasible to implement ethics-based drug policies. And they would be closer to scientific mechanisms instead of this current situation, which is more like power politics and some ideologies which we don't even know what's behind, like a bill proportion. Because the policy process is, policy making is actually a process, so it would need some type of a self-correction or some kind of a feedback to be like a process in which we can take into consideration the consequences and then kind of readjust or fine-tune the policies itself or the law itself. It's kind of like a legal vigilance. I don't know if there's a better term for it. I just coined this up so that there should be a mechanism to follow the kind of like the afterlife of laws after they be made, so that how their implementation can work, or what can be adjusted, or what are the consequences, what are the side effects of that law. So this should be kind of fed back to as a process in order to make the laws better. If there's no feedback, then it's just the law is done, and the consequences could be even grave, and there is no chance of changing them. Yeah, I've been mentioning this evidence-based risk assessment by not at all. This is a good approach. And there's another concept of the drug policy ratchet. So this means that the drug policy is kind of like a ratchet. It always gets tighter and tighter, but it happens very rarely that it kind of for example, some substance goes to a lower schedule. There are some exceptions, but basically it is always going to the tighter and the more like longer sentences, prison sentences for drug-related offenses and so on. So this is also not. The justice is not implemented here because there should be mechanisms to down schedule some substances while upscheduling some others. So in the case of new psychoactive substances, this is a vendor's page, you can see some strange things besides these synthetic cannabinoids. There is like ketchup for some reason on this page sold, and also this stuff which is a truth serum. So this has been the most important phenomenon in the last 5 years, what happened in the drug scenario, that these NPS had appeared. And concerning them, they can be seen as a consequence of failed drug policies. And there are analog laws which say that those substances which have similar effects to other banned substances are also evil. Or there are generic laws which define a structural similarity, and they control drugs based on this strict structural similarity, which is also very unbased. Like if one drug has like one carbon atom more than the other, it can go into the evil category from non-evil category. So this is really like there's a lack of concept behind it. And we can even say that there's a molecular racism or discrimination here. And it's also an interesting question if long-term effects really count. So if we say that some substances are banned because they have unknown long-term effects, then what is the situation with those substances which are legal and we know well that they have really negative long-term effects? And there is no ethical basis to use the precautionary principle anyway, which is the basis of these laws. I think I'm going to skip this. The UN Convention actually accepts that social factors has influence on the behavior of individuals and groups, and that the drug addiction is often the result of an unwholesome social atmosphere. So they actually try to say that it's not only the drug, but it can be the circumstances. So from drug dose, setting, behavior, outcome, actually this is the problem that this convention is looking only at the drug level. And so in summary, in this presentation I assess the fitness to purpose to combat addiction as a serious evil, and my opinion that it doesn't fit. So there is a chance to revise, reform or repeal these drug laws. There will be a UN gas meeting in 2016 next year, so maybe those people who are interested in a drug policy reform, they should, from the psychedelic scene, they should kind of activate themselves right now. So thank you for your attention.